Hi, this is Lindsay Simons, your host of Creating Community for Good podcast. Now, what you're about to see here on YouTube is actually just a snippet of the entire conversation. So, if you're interested in what my guests and I are talking about, go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you can search for Creating Community for Good podcast and look for Shanti Brien. This is episode 45. So, about this episode, this is really a heartfelt conversation about an immensely necessary topic for any community, especially ours here in the United States, which is justice and the criminal justice system. Shanti Brien is an author. And so we're going to talk about Almost Innocent from Searching to Saved in America's Criminal Justice System that was just published this year. And I encourage you to check it out and read it. Instead of ordering from Amazon, go to your local bookstore and support them. She is also a co-founder of what's called the Fog Break Justice, which is a national organization that collaborates with criminal justice professionals, civic leaders, and business change makers who are serious about fairness, equity, and inclusion. By trade, Shanti is a criminal defense attorney and offers tremendous insight and perspective in this podcast. So please join us as we talk about the criminal justice system and how we can create a more just community for all of us. Thank you, and shine on.
Being a woman in this field is not typical, but it's not atypical either. And I feel like I did talk about in the book somewhat. Part of it might have been more my youth than my gender, but a real sense of nervousness and uncertainty when the stakes are so high. So when my client's life essentially is on the line in so many cases. And even if it's not a life sentence or a very long sentence, the consequences for a criminal conviction are so severe that the pressure of that really got to me. And I felt that immensely. Yeah.
What's your why? Why do you do this work? I mean, it is so, the pressure is tremendous. And what a great gravity of responsibility. What has brought you to this space?
I think that it's a confluence of factors. I grew up in a family that had a lot of different aspects to it that I think I felt like we were othered, I guess. It's a weird way to say it, but let's say, so my grandmother was a paraplegic and in a wheelchair. And I remember vividly how we did not have access, like to the grocery store. We didn't have this was before the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that somewhat inspired my interest in working for disabled rights. But I grew up with a single mom. My father has mental illness, is really disabled by mental illness. My father's family is Native American. I'm an enrolled member of the Muskogee tribe. I also grew up somewhat like a brother. My uncle has Down syndrome and lived with me growing up. And so there were a lot of these experiences of being somewhat part of communities that really didn't have much of a voice. And so I feel like that led me somewhat to this work in criminal justice, and also somewhat to my work as a writer and as an author, and just the vital importance of sharing the human stories of people that don't have that opportunity. And I felt like I got to do that in my criminal appellate work simply by trying to humanize my clients for the judges as much as I could, to really turn their legal case into a story that, because that's how we make connections, right? That's how we connect with people, is by hearing their stories, learning their stories. And I think that's what draws me to this work. Is I'm a storyteller and I'm a story listener. Yeah.
Yeah. The podcast is all about creating community. So I'm hearing you and feeling or curious to know, do you believe that your work is actually creating a sense of community by advocating and telling the story of those who have been muted? Or is it something else that brings you a sense of connectedness? What does community mean to you?
Yeah. Community means I belong here. I'm welcomed here. I feel connected to the other people that are here. And I hope that through my book and through storytelling, I do create a sense of community, in pretty broadly defined there. But yeah, I hope to create a sense of urgency for people to, feel connected to this issue, feel that this is an issue. If you care about social justice, if you care about the well-being of our communities, this is an important issue to pay attention to. I more explicitly, I think, create community and try to create equitable, thriving communities through my newer work with Fog Break Justice.
Tell us about Fog Break.
Yeah, so Fog Break, we work with communities that are trying to create equitable outcomes. They're trying to build community trust, especially in criminal justice agencies. And it's very important to us, this sense of we are in this together as a community to thrive, to listen to each other, to connect, to value each other, for all aspects of our diversity.
Criminal justice is a very complex ecosystem. If you could pinpoint the biggest challenge in the system and your view of the solution, what would it be?
Oh, that's a hard question there.
That's like a lifelong journey there,
Right,
isn't it?
that's a whole podcast series, perhaps.
Yeah,
We could do
perhaps.
on that. I guess I would sort of generalize in two ways. One, the system's too big, and two, the system is unfair. So it's the biggest, incarceration system in the world. We incarcerate more people than any country in the world, including China, Russia. And we just are addicted to criminalizing behaviors. So I think it's really clear now. I think it's becoming really clear to many more people that we have to really shrink the system, make it radically smaller, decriminalize poverty and homelessness and mental illness and drugs and addiction. We really have to start thinking of alternatives to incarceration. So once we do that, though, there's still something left there. So I am really challenging people to reconsider this idea of violent crime. And so that we could start thinking about reducing sentences. So that's another way we could reduce the size of the system. So I had one client, for example, who was sentenced to 4 life sentences plus 70 years. So what does that even mean? What does that even mean? Yeah. And if you think of yourself or your partner or your son being sentenced to 1 month, 2 months, 6 months in prison, how absolutely devastating that would be if you really, really think about that. So I'm challenging people to reconsider this idea of violent crime so that we can reduce sentencing. Because what's the fair sentence for someone who's dealing marijuana and has a knife in his pocket? Does that deserve 5 years? Does that deserve 10 years? Is that a violent crime? So that would be another thing we could do. And then, like I said, once it's significantly reduced, we have to address the inherent bias. And it's becoming more and more obvious to people everywhere that criminal justice is maybe the most obvious example of systemic racism we have. So the bias there is baked into the system. It reinforces itself, and we have to find ways to address that. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast, but that has to be really taken on. It has to be taken on by the criminal justice agencies and professionals that are working there. And maybe that is because everyone's demanding that they do that. Right? People
now is definitely the time.
Streets demanding fairness.
And in your book, you begin with painting a picture of the privilege that your husband had as a white NFL player, and then a white collar business person. Next to the next chapter goes straight into a story where there are language translation challenges, and it's a Hispanic family that you're defending that is clearly innocent but deemed proven guilty. And what do you see as what's the heart of the bias training that you're trying to incorporate? I mean, for one, as an outsider, somebody who's not trained the way you are, the way I read this was to say, like, let's first just recognize that the contrasts of privilege and our biases of race, language. That's where I got into the gender concept with you, even just what you're wearing as a female, which would be different than what a man might be wearing. What is your thought on how do we bring more of that bias training or awareness to our community that it's obviously, like you said, the streets are demanding it. So what's the step towards progress that we can provide?
Really, I think there's two methods for doing this. One is really creating systems that prevent or greatly, greatly reduce discretion. So discretion, police have enormous discretion, prosecutors have enormous discretion, judges somewhat less, but still some. And it's just proven, studies show that the lesser amount of discretion, the less bias will come into those decisions. So, however that might be, putting in systems to reduce discretion. One great example, I think, is the Oakland Police Department. With advice and counsel from Jennifer Everhart, who's the preeminent scholar out of Stanford on bias, and particularly race bias, and as it relates to criminal justice. And she implemented a very small little discretion check where police had to state the reason that they were stopping someone or pulling them over, along with their demographic information.
Interesting.
And so what happened was a 40% decrease in the stops of African Americans in Oakland.
40% decrease because they're just blatantly calling
they
out.
have to say why they're stopping them. They have to say why they're stopping them. They do not have discretion to stop.
To just go for it, right? Any Black man driving down the street. As we hate to see that. We hate to say that that's a reality, but it is.
Right. And so the police officer knows that he has to be accountable to his decision to stop this person. And maybe it just takes that second thought to say, oh, I don't have a reason. And I'm not willing to put race down as the reason. And so I think it's putting systems like that in check. I also recommend just wide-scale education on systemic racism and the relationship between the criminal justice system and race, going back to slavery and going back to the very first establishments of police departments essentially were related to slavery. And I think when people start to have that sense of time and history and meaning, it can change you. It can change your perspective. It can bring a new perspective to your role in the system. So I think we have to have both, like, policy change, and changing hearts.
With this latest valuable episode, we'd love to thank you for joining us on the Creating Community for Good podcast. If you found today's show valuable, simply visit our website, creatingcommunityforgood.com, to leave a review, as well as to get access to additional resources and relevant links from this show. Stay tuned for more episodes.